Welcome to Mind and Heart. I'm Sister John Dominic, a foundress of the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist. It has been my joy to have been involved in Catholic education for over 30 years. One of my privileges for the community has been to create Lumen Ecclesiae Press, a publishing organization that develops educational resources used now by over 500 schools around the United States and the world. Lumen Ecclesiae is our call to magnanimity, our call to be large-souled, to do something greater for the Church. So today, I invite anyone interested in becoming a saint to join with us as we unpack the deep beauty, mystery, and certainties of our faith to transform our lives so that we can know, love, and serve God with our mind and heart. Welcome to Mind and Heart. I'm Sister John Dominic, and I'm very happy today, really honored to have with us Father Thomas Petri. And your title is actually so long. I'm going to let you give your introduction of what you do, and maybe you could also continue with all the etceteras that you're also involved in, Father.
No, my primary responsibility, I'm a priest of the Dominican province of St. Joseph, the Eastern Province, and right now I am assigned as the, it is a long title, Vice President and Academic Dean of the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. That takes up the entire business card.
Right. I was going to say, is it two-sided?
Yeah, it's two-sided. You have to flip it over to get to the end of it. So, yeah.
And what all does that mean?
Well, we are one of 7 pontifical faculties in the United States, and it means that the Holy See has given us the authority, which we've had since 1943, of granting degrees on the authority of the Holy Father himself. So Catholic University is another one right across the street, the John Paul II Institute. But it's a great honor. It means we have to be faithful to the Holy See, to the Vatican, to our Holy Father. And many seminaries value having professors with these sorts of degrees. So we're doing really quite well as a school.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think in particular, Father, you've been so wonderful. All the religious communities, ours in particular, welcoming us there to study, and all the other Dominicans. I even saw someplace, because by the way, you're great on Twitter. I follow you carefully, but I did say a prayer for you when you did your little thing for the Dominican nuns. You felt No, well, I've just finished. Of course, I was very happy to be asked to give a retreat to your community, to the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist, this past week. Last week, I was teaching cloistered Dominican nuns on the mysteries of revelation and fundamental theology. And the week before that, I was preaching a retreat for the Hawthorne Dominican Sisters at their home in Atlanta, Georgia. They're also a wonderful group of active sisters founded by Rose Hawthorne, who is the daughter of the great American poet Nathaniel Hawthorne. And it's amazing when you make the connection, just how coming together. And their work is so wonderful for the incurable cancer, and
that's what they do. They provide hospice for those who have terminal cancer, who cannot provide for themselves. And the amazing thing is they have 2 houses, one in Hawthorne, New York, and another in Atlanta, Georgia. They never bill insurance. They never bill Medicare. And actually, as part of their rule, they're not allowed to accept any donations from the family or the estate of the deceased for 35 to 40 years after that person dies. So just to make it clear that they're not doing any of this for the money or any sort of repayment. It's just the dignity of the person. Exactly. Yeah, that's it's beautiful. The dignity of the person. Oh, thank you. Oh. Well, Father, I, as a Dominican, and the fact that we do Disciple of Christ Education and Virtue, and now just to give you a little bit of background about us, because I know you're at the college level, and you're training people who are eventually be teaching that. We're in 400 schools now. We're in Singapore, so I guess you could kind of say it's pretty much international. We've also been working with the whole diocese. This past year, we had the Diocese of Sacramento implement it in all their schools. So I kind of taking the body of what really yourself, you write, I don't know if you remember this, but you helped me in the very beginning. I do remember this. This program, Disciples of Christ, Education and Virtue. And what I appreciate about it is the little cards that help you help children understand the virtue that are developed from drawings of children on what each of these virtues mean. I think I've given, because I've received a couple complimentary copies from you all, and I've purchased some, but I've given these to families, and they use them with their children at the dinner table. They will quiz them on the virtues.
And what it looks
cards.
like and it sounds like. That's right.
That's
and one
right.
thing you said to us, which I think is important, and maybe this isn't the best place to start this out, but you said if you know what it is, just fake it for a while, and eventually grace is going to kick in.
Well,
so
that's right. That's right. We all hear about the virtues of
Right.
prudence and justice and courage and temperance. And people often think, well, how do I become courageous? And I always tell them, fake it.
Yeah.
You fake it and find someone who's courageous and do what they do. And the more, because the whole point of virtue, as you know, sister, is you have to grow in it. And the way you grow in virtue is by doing virtuous things, and eventually it becomes second nature is the word we use. It becomes natural to you. But you're not going to be able to do that unless you're actually doing virtuous things, even if you don't yet have the virtues. So I always tell my students, fake it until you make it.
Right. Yeah, and then it comes eventually.
And then it comes.
So let's kind of go back, and maybe, because a lot of the people who are going to be watching these things are going to be teachers, and oftentimes just virtue is new. They understand. You can go. I tell people sometimes when I give a talk, I'll say, well, and the theological virtues, and I look out and I can see like there's sense of panic among people. They're like, don't ask me. And I'm like, well, don't worry. If you've been to Hobby Lobby or St. Michael and gone into Michael's craft store, you're going to know. You're going to see faith, hope, and love there.
Yeah.
But how can we kind of like bring people gently into this? And you, who I find to be an amazing, clear teacher.
Thank you.
How would you explain the virtuous life?
Well, I often begin by what people presume morality is about, because as you know, what you're describing here is the moment you bring up in any conversation the moral life or living morally, the first thing people think of is you're going to start telling them how they need to live their life, which is not true at all. But it's an unfortunate baggage. It's unfortunate baggage that we have to deal with. I always tell people that they tend to think that morality is about rules. You got to go to Mass on Sunday. That's how you be moral. You got to go to confession. You got to treat others as you wish to be treated. And that is part of morality, but that's not the main part of morality. I always say that St. Thomas Aquinas, our great doctor of the church, our great patron, and our great model, for St. Thomas, morality is about two things. What does it mean to be a happy person? And how do I get there?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Say
that again.
Yeah. What does it mean to be a happy person, and how do I get there?
Awesome.
And when you look at the Summa, the Summa Theology, where he talks about morality, it's basically those two issues. And virtue, what we talk about virtue, when we think about a virtuous person is not someone who's simply living by the rules or doing things because he has to, or because she knows she needs to, and kind of does it begrudgingly. The virtuous person knows this is going to make me happy. Yeah. I'm happy to do it, and I like doing it. Yeah. And that's what virtue is. And I think once you sort of start that way, people start to realize, actually, this whole morality thing isn't so bad as I thought. Because everybody wants to be happy. Right. And this was St. Thomas. It was Aristotle's view, that everybody wants to be happy. When you wake up in the morning, the whole point of putting one foot in front of the other is to get to happiness, and either today or some day down the road, right? Paying bills, changing diapers, taking out the garbage. It's about getting to happiness. If you're a person who can't get out of bed because you don't think you can be happy, well, then we need to start talking about getting you help, right? Right. Happiness is the whole goal of all of this. And of course, as Christians, we believe that God is the supreme happiness, and ultimately He's the one that's going to make us perfectly happy. Yeah.
And I think, Father, that's such a encouraging, joyful message, and I think that's, even in our time, when people, they're all looking for it and they're searching for it in so many different ways. And even when the beautiful thing that I love about when you really begin to understand, virtue and, study vice, but when you get in, people that may be living a life that's not the moral life or whatever, the path to virtue is a kind of like the easy way out, you know, because if you're struggling with a particular vice, or you can practice the virtues that is the opposite of that.
Exactly.
And how would you counsel somebody if they're like, take one of the capital sins.
Well, it's exactly what you say. What they were to come to me in confession. Aristotle says that virtue exists in the middle, right? So it's not the extreme. I mean, courage is in the middle between being foolish and being brazen, right? And, so, or being a coward and being foolish, I mean, the soldier who pops out of the foxhole and runs towards the enemy in a hail of fire is not courageous. He's a fool, right? The soldier who doesn't pop out of the foxhole when he's supposed to is a coward. That's true for all the virtues. There are these extremes. So my advice for people is always aim for the other extreme. Aim for wherever you are, aim for the other extreme, because trust me, you're not going to get to the other extreme.
Right, that's true.
You're already at one extreme. You're not going to all of a sudden become the other extreme. But if you're at this extreme and you aim for the extreme, you're probably going to hit the middle, which is exactly where virtue is. I'll tell you where this usually comes up is in my interactions with a lot of families, for instance. There's always the father or there's always the mother, and there are these personality types that everything has to be just so. Everything has to be in place. And when things aren't in place or when there's a mess, they become very temperamental and they can start to raise their voice. And they know this. Like, they come to me and they'll say, I lost my patience with my 3 children. I lost my patience with my wife And I'll say to them, I said, you're a person who likes everything in order and just right, aren't you? And they say, yeah, that's me, Father. I say, yeah, okay, that's an extreme. Because you have a family of children, and there's just no way of keeping all of that under control.
Right.
Okay, I'm sorry. So what I need you to do is what I'll say to them. What I need you to do is to think to yourself, the last time I went to Father Thomas Petri and talked to him, he told me, I need to just let some things go. I want you to give yourself permission and to give your family permission just to make a mess. Just to make a mess of the house. Throw everything around. It doesn't... Trust me, it's not going to make a mess of your house because you're not going to be able to do this.
Right.
But if you can aim for it, you'll end up becoming a more moderate, temperate parent. You'll become more virtuous as a parent.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in that, even there's a freedom. I think that's the other beautiful part of this is that there's a freedom in it. And you're not kind of, like when you said whether things are right or wrong. I mean, there's a moral code, of course, that we have to follow. But when we're living this life, there's a joy, there's a freedom that comes with it.
Well, and this is what St. Paul talks about, being free in the spirit. Aristotle says that the young should not study morality. Yeah. And it's because he knew that when we're young, we all want to know the right way to live. We all want to know what it means to be happy and how to become happy. And really, we all want a sort of manual, a sort of formula, like if I do this, if I do that, if I do this, I'll be happy. But as you know, sister, it just doesn't work. Life doesn't work that way.
Right.
And there's no formula here. There are, as you're right, there are certain things, it's black or white. If you do this, you've committed a mortal sin, you need to go to confession. But most of our Christian life, most of our moral life is in this in-between, in this gap. Like there's a field, there's a parameters beyond which boundaries which we should not step. But inside those boundaries is a whole heck of a lot of freedom on how we should live, what it means to be virtuous, what it means to be living in the spirit, what it means to have difficult conversations and how to do that. Things that aren't really matters of mortal sin, but really are matters of being good, happy, holy, prudent. And the church and our Catholic tradition has a lot to say about those matters. And hoping that people will grow into it so that they will assimilate or it'll become second nature to them what it means to be a gentle person, but also being forceful when you need to be forceful, essentially being prudent as a person. And
to be able to get to this, so when I talk to schools or talk, I give a presentation or even talk to principals or parents and these things. And you have to establish this language of virtue. I mean, you and I can talk about it because we're so familiar with this. But how would you, like you said, you've given the virtue cards to some of the families that have seen it, but encouraging schools that really want to create this Catholic culture, this Catholic identity in it, how can you see from maybe a pastoral perspective how this knowledge or this understanding of what the virtues are and all the aligned virtues that St. Thomas gave to us, just to make that a culture of freedom and goodness and
I think the groundwork is in some ways already laid in this whole emphasis we see in our culture, which we look at as sort of a bad thing. In many ways it is, but can be baptized, if you will, to serve our purposes in helping people grow in virtue, which is the way our culture talks about diversity, the way it talks about equality, the way it talks about you being you. These can be used by us because that's what virtue is. Virtue is my prudence is going to look a little different than your prudence.
Right.
My courage is going to look a little different than your courage. That's okay. There's a diversity even in how the virtues are lived out, one person to another. I think everyone ought to agree, and everyone probably does agree when they think about it, that even though we speak about freedom and diversity and inclusion and uniqueness and equality, I don't think anyone, when they, put their minds to it, and if you push them against the wall, think that means everybody can live however they want to live without consequence. I don't think anyone believes that. I think everyone believes that there is a lot of adaptability and flexibility in the human person. And at the same time, this has to be channeled to the common good, to the good of the country, the good of my community, the good of my family. And talking about virtue in that way, I find is helpful as a sort of entry point that the church really isn't about trying to make you follow certain rules. It's not about making you all the same. It's not where we don't have a cookie cutter mentality. It really is about you becoming you. And the only difference, we would say, is that who you are is not necessarily who you think you are, but who God knows you are.
Right, right. And I think that's really one of the beautiful things that when we talk about Catholic education and you want to focus on the formation of the child is that they can become the person God's created them to be, And also when we understand, original sin, but, because God intended everyone to live in friendship and to live in his grace.
Yes.
And original sin is what, separated us from his grace. But when we look, and this is really appealing to people when I talk to them, I'll say, if we look back to the state of original holiness and justice, and we can see where the theological virtues are the life of holiness, our relationship with God, and with justice, we look at the cardinal virtues. And then this original sin is this rupture that's taken place.
Right.
But when you begin to live the virtuous life, it's a way that you can heal that rupture and bring you back into this friendship with God.
Well, that's right. Yeah. So that the virtuous life, especially when it's catalyzed and empowered by the grace of God, actually can be elevating and healing. At the very least, trying to be virtuous and trying to live well and good prepares us to receive the gifts of grace that God wants us to receive. Because everyone who's walking around without grace, without living in relationship or friendship with God, even if they think they've got their life together and they think that they're happy, we're going to argue that in fact there's still a hole in your life. And it's the hole that God is supposed to fill up. And this is how God created us, that all of us are meant to be with him. He created us for himself. And people might think that they're doing well and they're succeeding in life, but in the end, God is trying to get through to them to remind them that they're really made for him and to be with him. And
really, that's our destiny.
Absolutely.
Our eyes are focused on eternity, and as you said earlier, that everyone does want to be happy. We're seeking that, and we can lay out this path of understanding. What virtue is. Is there anything? Of course, we have our resources which help educators, but is there any other books or anything that you would recommend for?
I recommend that anybody that if you go on Amazon or Google, you just Google for any books written about Aquinas and virtue, and you're going to find a wealth of knowledge there. Any books on Aquinas and grace, you're going to find a wealth of knowledge. There's a lot of great books by Matthew Levering and Michael Dauphiné are some great books that I think many of your viewers and audience would be able to relate to and understand. As Dominicans, of course, it's not just, we're a little biased on this. I think St. Thomas's understanding of virtue and grace is still valid and still speaks to the modern person, because he's the one who, even though it was 800 years ago, he's the one who figured a lot of this out for us.
Yeah, and just to underline one other thing too, when you going back again, what you were saying about, we look at the understanding about the moral life, like right or wrong, and people have difficulty with that, but when we're trying to evangelize or we're trying to reach the person on the street, the way in which our worldview as Dominicans, we see the truth. You can go up to someone and say, you want to be, happy. Let's have a conversation.
Well, and that's the Dominican way, right? Is that we acknowledge that actually the starting point, we have a lot in common on the starting point, that we all want to be happy. And help. Here, let me share with you what I think happiness is and how I'm going to get there. You want to come along. It's really, that's St. Dominic.
Well, Father, thank you so much. We will continue with another podcast because I got some other questions, but we need to conclude this one. Father Thomas Petri, thank you very much for joining us for this episode of Mind and Heart. If you like this episode of the Mind and Heart podcast, I invite you to click on the next available podcast and continue to enrich your mind, heart, and soul.